My name's Robert Muscat. I'm the President of the Military History Society of New South Wales, and we welcome our members and non-members to our monthly lecture this morning. Now, before I begin and introduce our speaker, can I just remind you to either turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Now, we've got a full house. So we'll just, if you've got a seat next to you, you might want to put your hand up, because we've still got a few more people coming down and registering this morning. That'd be greatly appreciated. If you see somebody who's trying to find a seat, you might want to direct them to the seat next to you. That'd be great. No, that's right. Thanks, Ian. Now, I'll also remind people, I know we've had a number of people purchasing books. We can do that after the lecture. There'll be some question time after Dr Tom Lewis' presentation, and he has assured me that he'll stick around for a while and have conversations with people as well. So I'd like to formally present Dr Tom Lewis as our speaker this morning. Many of you would know that Tom is a renowned military historian here in Australia and internationally, has written 22 books. And today he's speaking to us on a combination of two books that he's recently published, The Secret Submarine and Australia's Coastal War, about Australia's involvement here and the submarine warfare in the Pacific. Tom, as I said, is an author, a retired naval officer, and a retired secondary school teacher. He was the director of the Darwin Military Museum in its development from 2009 to 2013. And is also the recipient of the Order of Australia. So can we put our hands together and welcome Dr. Tom Lewis.
Thanks a lot, John, and that's me. Now, to make sure you stay awake, there is a lucky door prize. By the look of the audience, it looks like some of you have grandchildren. Yes. So this book has just come out. It's called Australia Remembers. It's basically aimed at 10 to 15-year-olds. It's Gallipoli. So it's what young people should know about Gallipoli. So at the end of the talk, I'll ask a question, and the first person to answer it correctly gets the book. And there's also copies over there. So we'll do that at the end. Yes, so you're used to military history. Some of the terms that you'll see on the screens, some people find them a bit much. The topic is quite grim. Some of the numbers are staggering, the number of people who died around Australia in World War II. And I don't mean to make light of such things, but one of the things you learn in the military, especially in wartime, is black humour sometimes helps. So forgive me if that creeps in. The source material for especially Australia's Coastal War is basically derived from these books, which I have been working on over the years. My first book came out in 1989, and you see that quite a few of them are sort of orientated towards the north. But basically, the research that I did for those over the last 35 years allowed me to push a lot of that data that I already had into Australia's Coastal War. For example, I was on a grant about 25 years ago. I was in Japan. I hired a translator. I spent a week in their war records office. And I can't read Japanese, but he could. You can still, however, understand things like carrier deck logs, the name of the aircraft, the tail number of the aircraft that took off, the amount of ammo it expended, the amount of holes in it, the number of holes, and that sort of thing does make sense in any language. And so a lot of the materials that I had gathered over the years have been pushed into those, especially Australia's Coastal War. Some final numbers. Who knew? 1,992 enemy attacks around Australia in World War II. And I'll go into a little bit of detail, but if you do end up buying a copy of Australia's Coastal War, there are appendices at the back that list all of the different attacks, air raids, surface actions and things like that. Statement number of casualties, fatalities. These are fatalities, not wounded. Generally wounded are 3 times the number. So who knew, again, there were this many deaths around Australia's coasts in World War II. About 40% of them are American. The Americans were here in quantity. And some Dutch. And it does include civilians who got caught up in bombing raids and things like that. What does it look like in terms of time? The first actions that we saw in Australia in World War II were German. And the Germans came back at the end of the war. But after that they became Japanese. So you can see the submarine war, for example, is in 2 tranches. It's 1942, beginning off Darwin, and it's 1943. They sort of had a Christmas vacation, but they decided they wanted to come back again and have a go at cutting Australia off from America once more, which is what Coral Sea is all about. The air war kept up from basically the 15th of February 42 to mid-1944. So let's have a look at some of the detail. You've heard of the Sydney. More people died on HMAS Sydney than were lost in the entire Vietnam War for Australia. So I said to one of my publishers about 6 or 7 years ago, that was a statistic, and he sort of looked at me and said, well, do you want to write about it? And I said, well, lots of books have been written about the Sydney, and some of them are very good, and some of them are very bad. And he said, go for it. So we did, and that was a book called The Sinking of HMAS Sydney. I took that photograph about 30 years ago. I was in Rhodes for a Christmas holiday, walking down the street with family members. What is a mine doing on the street of Rhodes? It's actually still there. It's one of the German mines that were recovered on beaches at the beginning of the war. And this, strangely enough, are the first fatalities on the Australian shore in World War II. They're two young sailors who were trying to defuse a mine, and it blew up in a place called Beachport. And the Royal Australian Navy has a service every year, a very small service attended by family members to commemorate those 2 fellows. Who remembers their name these days? Sydney, of course, far better known, 645 fellows. And this was an enormous mystery, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with. How could the pride of the fleet that had sunk the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Calani in an action in the Mediterranean, how could the pride of the fleet disappear, and then it turns out was sunk by a German armed surface raider? What is a surface raider? Everybody says to themselves, how could they sink our mighty cruiser? And it was a mystery, and there was much misinformation written about the Sydney. Some astounding claims, sunk by a Japanese aircraft carrier, a Japanese submarine was involved 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. All these sort of claims over the years until finally the wreck was discovered off Western Australia along with the Cormorant. Last year on a cruise liner, I do talks on cruise liners these days, I was able to do a service talk and a talk over the top of HMAS Sydney. So it's quite something to think. There below you, thousands of feet below you, is the wreck of that ship. It looks like 2 people got off the Sydney. One of them was Tom Clark. He was from Brisbane, and he was the one who was washed up on Christmas Island on a Carly float. The DNA analysis has been done. It took 2.5 years by the Navy and the AFP to do that. And we tracked down who he is. I wrote a paper recently. Does it add anything to the story of the combat action? And the answer is no, it doesn't. And lots of discussion about how Clark ended up in the Carly float and why didn't anybody else. Well, if you go and have a look at a warship next time you see one alongside in Sydney, you'll see there are no lifeboats. It's its own lifeboat. So, of course, close-range combat like that shreds everything as well, so a Carly float is lucky to get off the ship. I think Navy in the end were pestered so much they consented to the search, and they didn't really think that it would happen. When David Means was hired and the geo-sounder, they only put one naval officer on board. He was a lieutenant, John Perryman. He's actually also a naval historian, written a couple of good books, and he was the only one to be on board when the ship was discovered. The Japanese then come into the action in a big way. So the war starts with submarines off, this is Japanese submarines, off Northern Australia. The first one that was sunk, and I was talking to a gentleman just before, who's the son of one of the people on board HMAS Deloraine, which is the corvette that sunk a submarine outside Darwin. It still is there today. I'll jump back to that. So the fight starts in January 42. The aircraft, which I'm talking about now, and the surface ships come in later. So it's submarines first, then aircraft and surface ships. So I'll hop up backwards and forwards in time. Asked an American the other day, in fact I was on a ship and I asked some Americans, do you know the name of the carrier, the aircraft carrier sunk off Australia? And they did. USS Lexington, sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea. I said, what about the other aircraft carrier? And none of them knew what I was talking about. It was their first aircraft carrier, Langley, sunk off northwestern Australia by Japanese Val dive bombers. Most Americans don't seem to know it's there, but they lost more people in the sinking of the Langley and her two escort ships than they lost in Coral Sea. A lot of this stuff you see is a sort of mystery, and that's why I put a book together called Australia's Coastal War, because I wanted to wrap the whole thing up for Australians who I think should know the enormous sacrifice and the enormous number of actions around Australia in the war. And of course, if you study the lessons of history, hopefully you are not going to repeat them. Does what happened in World War II have implications for what happened now? Yes, of course it does. Nuclear submarines, are we ready for another war if one happens, and so on. Coral Sea, of course, kicked it off for the Americans. They were much engaged in the Atlantic convoys before that, denying that they were involved in the war, though they did lose ships and lives in Atlantic convoys before this. But Pearl Harbor really puts the fireworks under those people in America who said we should keep out of the fight. Who wants to join another world war? And if you'd lost your son in that sort of World War I action, you'd probably be saying that too. So I sympathise, but this really says, no, we now need to get engaged. It's not a European war, it's a world war, and the Pacific is our backyard. Japan attacked all across the Pacific. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor on one day. So they're attacking in Malaya, they're attacking in Hong Kong, the Philippines, which, if you like, is an American colony of some sorts. The Japanese go after an empire and they get it. Now they've got to hang on to it. This is the reason why you find so many Americans in Australia in World War II. Because if you look at that map, you can see that to fight from San Diego, to fight from California is going to be probably impossible. No nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can stay on station forever in those days. So, looking at the big picture, and I was an intelligence analyst for a long time, they always say start with maps. If you look at the big chart, you see, okay, the centre of gravity is going to be Tokyo. What is centre of gravity? That's basically the thing that sucks all the action towards it. So the European war is only going to be over when somebody goes into the bunker in Berlin and puts a bayonet against Adolf Hitler's chest and says, right, we've got you. The same thing for the Pacific War. Tokyo is going to be where it's all at. That's what you've got to orientate towards, even though the Japanese are across the Pacific in the meantime. So you're going to have to use Australia as a base. Guess what? Australia is also being used as a base these days by America. Yes, because you've got another possible enemy shaping up in another possible sort of area close to Japan. You know what I'm talking about. So eventually it becomes 3 attack lines. The island hopping with MacArthur at the helm, so to speak, the sea actions with Nimitz at the helm, so to speak, and the land actions, British Army, General Slim in the end, and that one actually bogged down. Slim wrote in his memoirs, running into the Japanese army was bad enough, running into the Japanese Marines was like running into a stone wall. They just did not give. So it was a very hard fight there, which is largely forgotten, those campaigns on land in those days, but well worth reading. George MacDonald Fraser, who wrote the Flashman series, I recommend his autobiography. He was there, he's a great writer. So what's the Langley doing off northwestern Australia? By this time she's been retired, she's actually carrying aircraft as opposed to being an aircraft carrier. She's not flying them off anymore, she's just carting them around. But she looks like a good price to the Japanese, and so they came after her with Val dive bombers. And they had aircraft carriers hanging around the vicinity in that time. And of course the biggest attack that they did was the attack on Darwin, which I'll hop on to in a sec. Langley was sunk in fairly good weather, and they got most of the people off. They put them on board the Picos and the Edsel, which are two of their escort ships. Japanese came after them the next day. And there's the last shot taken of the Edsel, a 4-stack Clemson-class destroyer. They expended enormous amounts of ammunition to sink her, and they were told off afterwards for not being better at their gunnery. But look at the numbers there, 902 people lost. And America has largely forgotten this. If you go to America and some of their excellent museums, even the Pacific War Museum, they don't really mention much about Australia and all those lives lost. It's a strange thing, history. Coral Sea, I've got an e-book out over there called Battle of Coral Sea Explained. And what it says is, if it wasn't for Coral Sea, the Japanese may have had 6 aircraft carriers at Midway rather than 4. And if they had 6 versus the American 3, history probably would have been written differently. And Australia would be open for invasion once more. Dismissed in February 42 as too difficult by the Japanese. Now, if the Americans are pushed back to California, Australia's open for possible invasion. And why wouldn't you? All of those enormous amounts of resources. Even in World War II, without knowing about things like uranium and so on, Australia's a very resource-rich country. So maybe Coral Sea, by being the check of Japanese force, maybe Coral Sea contributes to Midway in such a positive way that it saved Australia. It's said by some to be the most confusing sea battle in history, and I'm not going to go into it. You'll be pleased to know, look at that map. It's terrible. It actually takes place over 6 days. But in essence, what happened at Coral Sea is simply this. The Japanese were going to invade Port Moresby, and the Americans stopped them doing it. And both sides lost a carrier in the process. The Japanese a small one, the Americans a big one. So invading Port Moresby was all about, if we can run our ships, submarines and aircraft down the east coast of Australia, we can stop those horrible Americans from getting to Australia and using it as a base, which is what they were going to do. That was the big plan, use Australia as a base. So the US sunk the Shoho, which is a small escort carrier. She was basically there to safeguard the landing as it went through in Port Moresby. They sunk that, and the Japanese sink the Lexington. This is the first battle in history where all the sighting and the fighting is done by aircraft. Not one ship fired a gun in anger against another enemy warship. They fired against enemy aircraft, but not against enemy ships. And this is a turning point in history. The day of the battleship is now over. The day of the aircraft carrier, and eventually the submarine, has come, and it's now going to change history forever. Jump back to air war. Air war takes place across the north of Australia all through the war, basically, from the start of the Coral Sea, the start of the Pearl Harbor campaigns after that, to mid-44. And the Japanese air operations, and I haven't put them on that map there, go all the way down to Hobart, because they have things like submarine-launched aircraft doing surveillance flights over Hobart, and Auckland, and of course, as you would probably know, Sydney. Not one shot was fired in anger against any of those Japanese aircraft. Not one. even though they were clearly marked with the Hinamaru, the big red circle, on the wings. It's early in the war, people are scared of opening fire. Am I really allowed to do it? That's common. I know from my own personal experience. When you go and you're suddenly engaging, it's a big surprise to you. Of course, in 1944, if the Japanese had tried it again, hopefully we would be better forewarned and forearmed. Darwin was the biggest attack on Australia in terms of an air raid that we've ever had. It was launched from 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. 188 aircraft participated in the first raid, and there was a second raid on the same day with 54 land-based bombers. So the first raid is 188 aircraft, 36 of them are Zero fighters, and the others are Val dive bombers and Kate vertical bombers. They come down the Apsley Strait, which is a great navigational feature if you're looking out the window to navigate, as they were doing. You come down the strait in between the 2 Tiwi Islands to the north there, and you cross the coast to the east of Darwin. Why do you do that? It's 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Why do you do that? Because that puts the sun behind you, it blinds the enemy, us, who are going to be firing at you. It's one pass over the target, and you go straight north and west back to the carriers for a second breakfast. Being too scared to eat the first one, which is what happens in most carrier operations. So it's a short, sharp raid. Each aircraft carries 1 bomb. You drop the bomb, you go. You don't hang about, circling or doing anything like that. You go because you're valuable, and so are the aircrew. There was a warning given. A lot of mistakes in Darwin, pretty common in war. War is chaos, believe me. And this one here, for example, was misinterpreted. Not through incompetence, it was just misinterpreted. The end result is there, 11 ships, 236 of our people dead. About half of them, 128, in a paper I wrote for the calculation, were American. 128 were American. Biggest loss of life on the day was the Peary, USS Peary destroyer. 88 people died on that in the harbour. The wreck is still there, though it's been largely salvaged. 30 aircraft destroyed. I wrote that book there, which is now out of print, though you can get it second hand. It's about that thick in hardback. It's a forensic analysis of what happened, and also it hopefully lays paid to some of the myths about the Darwin raid. The government covered it up, hundreds more died, etc., etc. Then what happened was the Japanese settled down to doing this on a weekly basis. Betty bombers, they're called. Fun fact for you, all Japanese bombers in World War II are named after women. So Betty, Val, etc. All Japanese fighters are named after fellows. Oscar, Pete, and so on. What about the Zero, I hear you say? That was Zeke, and it was basically, everybody started calling it the Zero because it was made in the year 0 cent, and that was what the Japanese called it. Why do you do that? Because you can't spell Mitsubishi and you can't say it either. So it's much easier to have a code name that everybody can recognise. That's a Betty being sent about by a Spitfire. And that was the book that I went to Japan to get the records for, and showed how many bombing raids the Japanese actually did make. So most of the flights are against the Northern Territory because that's where most of the assets are. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to stop the Japanese, trying to stop the enemy, that's us, from attacking the Japanese Empire of Indonesia, Timor, New Guinea, to use the modern names. Because you don't want basically your attacks coming from down south, as you're trying to secure New Guinea so you can use it as a base to run submarines and aircraft down the east coast to stop the Americans coming. So even though Port Moresby was a check, you still had the Japanese being bloody-minded and very brave and very determined, doing things like the Kokoda Track operations. You're trying to take Port Moresby that way, and that didn't work either. But that was the whole idea of New Guinea operations, to stop the Americans using Australia as a base. Some of the raids are more tragic than others. This one was against Broome, resulting in the deaths of 86 people, most of them women and children. And it was basically the arrival of 9 Zero fighters with a Babs navigation aircraft leading the way. They arrived at just the wrong time when a whole heap of flying boats were on the harbour, starting their engines up and preparing for a flight south. They were full of Dutch evacuees who were fleeing the Japanese, mostly women and children. Japanese arrived precisely at the wrong time, about 10 o'clock in the morning, saw the target and strafed them. If you go to Broome and you're on the wharf, the wrecks can be seen at low tide on your left. If you're on a cruise liner, you'll be on your right, and you can see the wrecks of the aircraft coming out of the water at low tide. Why the Dutch, I hear you say? Because this is the time of colonial empires. Have a look at them. All across Africa, South America and so on, colonial empires are fashionable. Everybody's doing them. So if you're a powerful European country, you've got possessions spread around the world. So that's why you find curious things like the Dutch paying the penalty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in Broome. Darwin was preceded, and I always like to put this one in because everybody forgets about poor old Robert, but the idea that the Japanese were going to come and attack Australia was in our minds. And we had patrols out, and the Americans had patrols out to see if we can push them away and so on, to get intelligence as to where they are. Those aircraft carriers were 300 kilometres from Darwin. They weren't detected on the 19th of February. Buell ran into a Mavis flying boat on the 15th, and both of them fought each other, and they shot each other down. Neither of the planes have been found, and one of the Japanese died. The rest of them got rounded up eventually, and they ended up in Cowra, and some of them died in the breakout. So this is why you find the Americans here in quantity, because the Americans are basically going to be using Australia as a base. If we can push the Japanese north, eventually we'll get within striking range of Japan itself, or what they call the home islands. And of course we hope to do that with aircraft carriers as well. But this is why startled Americans found themselves in the Officers' Club. It's a tent. Near Darwin in the wet season, and wondering what they'd done to deserve this. It's a horrible place to be. There's no pubs, there's no women, there's no beer, and if there is beer, it's warm. So they were there, and they paid the price. The Catherine raid is the furthest penetration of Australia's landmass, 300 kilometres. And this particular raid was unescorted, no fighters. So it's a few days after, sometime after, a few weeks after the Darwin raid, we were so demoralised, disorganised, and in such a state of chaos, the Japanese could send bombing raids over Australia without fighter escort, because we didn't have the fighters to fly against them. Not one Spitfire or Hurricane was flown in 1942 by the Australians, or anybody else, in the defence of Australia. This is 2 years after the Battle of Britain, where both of those aircraft have proved themselves wonderful machines. So when the Japanese arrive, the defence is flown by 10 American pilots in P-40 Kitty Hawks, and they flew the defence of Northern Australia for most of the rest of 1942. I was so startled by this, I wrote a book called Eagles Over Darwin, because I think the Americans deserve to be thanked for what they did. The bombing raids were pretty much all the same. You find what they call the Betty bomber, twin engine, high speed, long range, very good machine, coming all the way from what's now Timor in Indonesia. Zero fighter escort most of the time. The zero fighter escort is basically to intercept our fighters and allow the bombers to do their job and then turn around and get them home. What we want to do, if we have fighters and radar and anti-aircraft guns and so on, and eventually we did, is shoot the bombers down before they bomb the target, if you can. That was the last zero fighter alive in the world, I think. I was in Tokyo and interviewed him in 2015. We were getting ready for the 75th anniversary of the Darwin air raids. He actually bombed, he actually flew in Pearl Harbor and Darwin. Interesting fellow. So you do find Americans who have their names on airfields south of Darwin. If you join the Grey Nomad Trail, you'll still see some of the 51 airfields that were built in Northern Territory in World War II. All of them, almost all of them, by the Americans and the Seabeak organisation. and you find their names on those airstrips and you drive past Strauss. Who's Strauss? Well, he was a squadron leader who died, and so on. Eventually we start getting our act together. This is what you call in intelligence terms a fused defence. So you use radar to tell you the bad guys are coming. You have a CAP, a combat air patrol of fighters up and ready, and you can vector them towards the threat. If they start to bomb at night, which they did because they were being mauled a bit by us eventually, you need searchlights. And AA guns are a really good means of deterring the enemy and hopefully also shooting him down. And eventually, by 1943, we do start to get a good defence. But it basically was absent for most of 1942. When I say absent, I mean it was there, but it wasn't very, very effective, and also it was poorly trained. So there are lives lost due to that lack of defence in 1942. In 1943, it turns around. Spitfires, for example, were deployed in 1943 by the WWII. That's an anti-aircraft gun at Darwin Military Museum. So, strangely enough, the RAF pilots were all British experienced. They'd been over in Britain flying, as we had been since 1939. Don't get me wrong. Australia did a really good job in 1939, 1940, 1941 of going where the enemy was and fighting him. HMAS Sydney being an example, thousands of aircrew going to Europe to fly with the British and so on. They did an excellent job. But it left Australia largely undefended. We didn't have enough, small population of 6 million, we hadn't spent enough, we weren't ready. So that's why, when the war comes to Australia, we do so badly. So eventually the RAF, lots of political pressure, the RAF should be allowed to fly in the defence of Australia with fighters, get their way, and Spitfires were deployed. And eventually, towards the end of 43, we start turning the Japanese around. We're now mounting bombing raids into their territory. And it's not over there, but there's a book I wrote called Bombers North, which is the converse to the one I wrote called The Empire Strikes South. That one was all about the Japanese coming south and hammering us. Bombers North is all about us going north and hammering them. Largely American efforts, but lots of Australians, and also, would you believe, the Dutch? The Dutch flying a squadron of B-25 Mitchells, largely coming back with feelings of revenge. Spitfires are pretty good, but it's a hot, hard war up there. Dirt strips, working as mechanics, for example, under trees and so on. And if you've been to Darwin in the wet season, I sincerely advise you don't. It's a really tough place to be. You have all of these little actions across the top of Australia, and I put them into Australia's coastal war because they're forgotten otherwise. This one here, for example, Patricia Cam's bombed by a Japanese float plane, which then lands on the water and says, "Get on board, you." He refuses. Len Kentish, who was a missionary priest on board, they managed to force him onto the aircraft and took him away for intelligence purposes. And when that Japanese base was bombed by us some weeks later, one of them, in a fit of anger because his friend had died, ordered Kentish to be executed in reprisal. So he just disappeared, a priest on a small ship. Also disappearing are things like HMAS Yarra, a sloop. She had a little convoy of 3 ships. She came across an enormous Japanese force, as you can see there in the top right, and they sunk her in no short order, with enormous loss of life. Don't get me started about Teddy Shan, because I can be very boring. But Teddy Shan took 78 years to get his Victoria Cross, which I think was disgraceful. And I wrote his biography, his autobiography, Teddy Shan BC. But before that, I wrote a book called On and Denied, because he hadn't got the VC at that time, and I was saying he should. But at the same time, I was saying people like Rankin there and Gunner Taylor, top left, should have also been given Victoria Crosses. Not one medal was given to anybody on board HMAS Yarra. Because of administrative oversights, it has to be approved in Britain and so on and so on. So there's several Victoria Crosses that should have been awarded for the Navy in World War II. Never were awarded, and probably never will be now, because there's a fair bit of opposition to retrospective honours and things like this. But for me, it's about undoing a wrong. So at least he got his, and hopefully his name will be remembered in a ship, in a combat ship from forever. HMAS Sheen, the submarine, will go out of service probably in another 10 years or so, but hopefully that name will be carried on into the next if it's a nuclear Virginia class. Speaking of submarines, here's the submarine operations. So again, it's the same thing. We want to stop Australia being used as a base. So we'll cut it off from America, and that's why they're all concentrated on the east coast. Except they started in the north because they wanted to close Darwin down as a port. They don't want Darwin being used as a base to run operations against their newfound empire. So they decided to close Darwin down with 4 submarines, and it was a complete and absolute disaster. They lost one, that's it there. 80-man submarine, it's all sealed up north of Darwin Harbour. If you go into Darwin on a cruise liner, you almost go over the top of it. And every time a Japanese warship comes to Australia and goes to Darwin, they stop and have a little service over the top of their buoys. There's 80 of them still inside it, it's unpenetrated. I wrote a book on it called Darwin Submarine, I-124. Big submarine, 79 metres long, this one. Most of their subs are about 85, 90. That's 2 Olympic swimming pool heats. They're a big boat. So this was the idea on that particular day, to place the submarines here to lay mines. They were capable of laying mines. And what wasn't hit by the minefields, that is us, would be torpedoed by their submarines. It went very wrong. HMAS Deloraine, one of our corvettes, sunk the I-124 in a short, sharp action. I wrote a book about that one too. Darwin Submarine I-124. It's out of print now, I think, but you can find it second hand. It's an interesting story. It was a very close fought action. The submarine nearly won it. It was a matter of seconds. There's a chart I found in Darwin, and you can actually see there's the TV islands down the bottom in the middle. And you can actually see the track of the submarines. You notice one of them's gone off to the right. It's gone off to the east. They went and laid mines in the Torres Strait, and then they came back to take part in the torpedo action days after. Not one of the 120 mines they laid sank anything because of the enormous and fierce tides that you get in northern waters, which basically tore them all off their moorings, deposited them on beaches and so on where they were blown up by rifle fire. So it was pretty much a failure. But that's really the only failure the Japanese have. After this, they started doing really well. That's a plaque to the submarine war dead that the Japanese Prime Minister Abe visited when he was in Australia some years ago, and I was able to meet him. And that's a modern sonar picture of that submarine still sealed up. The East Coast Submarine War is massive. It took me a long time to research all the ships and names and fatalities and so on. It's in an appendix in the back of Australia's Coastal War. Of course, living in Sydney, the one you would be familiar with the most is the midget submarine attack. I did a separate book on that called Attack on Sydney Harbour. In it I got rather passionate and argued that Muirhead Gould, the Royal Navy officer who was supposedly in charge of the defence of the harbour, had done a disgraceful job, and not one of our fellows was given any sort of decoration afterwards, even though we were responsible for sinking 2 of their midget submarines. As I said earlier, the surveillance flights over Sydney, Auckland, Hobart, Melbourne, etc. were not fired at. They were clearly marked Japanese aircraft. The boom defence was not finished in Sydney. They simply went round the end of it. It was finished in Darwin. This is months after the first air raid on Australia. You would think that a Royal Navy professional Commodore who had been part of the investigative panel into the sinking of the Royal Oak by a submarine in Scapa Flow, you would think he would be onto it. He was there for a year and a half, making sure we had proper rules of engagement, making sure that corvettes and so on were properly armed. They weren't. Even on the night itself, he failed to do things like stop the ferries running, for some reason, because if it's calm water, you can see a periscope, yes? If it's choppy, periscope's not seen so easily. So it's a real mess, the raid on Sydney. The midget submarine in the War Memorial has just been put back, by the way, if you're down in Canberra. She's just been put back on show. That's a composite of the 2 that were recovered from the harbour. Now, I had an interesting time in the book working out which bit came from which submarine. It was basically plug and play. The last time I did a talk here, actually, I think it was on the Anti-Submarines, they had the tail of one of them upstairs on display. So there's bits of the two submarines scattered around Australia, but they were put together to make one so it could do a truck tour of the southern states to show everybody we are at war. This came into one of their biggest harbours and killed 21 people. By the way, while you're inspecting the submarine and writing your name and graffiti on the side, as was done a lot, put your hand in your pocket and buy some war bonds. So it was to raise money and raise consciousness. Teddy Sheehan was billeted on the Cuttable, and he was on his last leave seeing his girlfriend in Tasmania. If he hadn't been, he probably would have been one of those who died that night. And the Armidale action in which he took part on the 1st of December 1942, maybe he wouldn't have been there. There were also gun attacks on Sydney and Newcastle by the motherships after they'd spent days waiting for the three midgets to come back. More an act of spite than anything else. Fort Scratchley in Newcastle opened fire, and for that they must be congratulated. And the third submarine was found outside Sydney Harbour years after. She's 2/3 full of sand. Probably the bodies of the submarines are still inside it. We don't intend to try and find out. There are cameras over at the wreck site. It's a war grave, probably. And what actually happened to them was probably they came out of the harbour, they couldn't find the motherships, and basically they ran out of battery power. They're only electric, these submarines, not diesel, and they decided to shoot themselves and sink the submarine. Because it was pretty high-tech technology at the time, and you don't want the bad guys, the enemy, getting hold of the tech. The loss of the Centaur, the hospital ship, was probably the most notorious submarine action off the east coast. A great tragedy, and the person who did it, I would say that he probably did it deliberately. The hospital ship was lit up very brightly, it was at night. It's reasonably, you are shooting by periscope, and of course the periscope's only up and having a look for a couple of seconds each time, but I would have thought that a hospital ship at night would be fairly sort of unmistakable. Survivors were in the water for a day and a half before being rescued by an American destroyer, the Mugford. And after the war, when there was investigation done into this sort of thing, eventually it turned out it was the I-177. And the commander by this time was serving time in jail for other things. He was then let out at the end of his sentence, and he was not prosecuted later for the sinking of the Centaur. It takes time for the historians and so on to get into the records and things like that after the war. It wasn't the I-178, which was suspected for some time, and I wrote a short book on her recently, and it's called The Secret Submarine because the RAF didn't know they sunk it. They attacked it, but they weren't sure they'd sunk it. I went and had a look at the Japanese records, and I was able to show it never got home. So therefore they did sink it. It's quite an interesting book, I think, but you need to be pretty much into submarines and aircraft in World War II to read it. There's a lot in the book about how long does it take a submarine to dive in World War II and why? What's the best way to attack a submarine with an aircraft? What's the best way to defend yourself against an aircraft and things like that. So, interesting I think, but one for the purists maybe. It was a nighttime battle. Basically the submarine was caught on the surface, running her diesels to recharge her batteries I expect. She was attacked by one of our Beaufort bombers, 3-man bomber, three depth charges. It looks like they probably hit her with one, and she didn't dive. Now, she didn't dive when the aircraft was making its attack run either, and that probably says she couldn't. Because if you see an aircraft in World War II, or even today, from a submarine, you dive. You dive deep and make like a rock, because they will kill you. They can see down to 150 foot, they're good at their job. About 50% of the submarines sunk in World War II across the world was sunk by aircraft. The other 50% by ships. So this was a fight, basically on the surface. She didn't dive. The second aircraft came out, rather like a wrestling tag team match, took over, dropped her three. This time the submarine defends herself with her 20mm gun. She's got an anti-aircraft gun, which a lot of submarines did in those times, and she still doesn't dive. By the time the third aircraft comes out, she's gone. Now she's either managed to dive or she's been sunk. We don't know which. But she didn't get back to Truck Lagoon, that we do know, and therefore the credit must go to the RAF for sinking this submarine. The last submarine operation around Australia was the biggest in World War II. An enormous number of ships and aircraft and shore posts and so on spent a lot of time looking for this one submarine. She was one of 41 German submarines based in the Pacific. Who knew? Based out of Penang. And she was under the command of Captain Robert Tim, who was going to sweep the seas. There's his little emblem there. And he made this patrol of New Zealand and southern Australia. It's quite a long patrol, but he only manages to make 2 kills. In that time, we weren't actually sure whether we were after one submarine or several, but we put a lot of ships, a lot of time and effort into this submarine chase, and we didn't find it. He actually was unlucky a bit. He was lining up for a shot in the Derwent, for example, when an aircraft was sighted through the periscope, and he dived immediately and sat on the bottom of the Derwent. The aircraft wasn't after him, it was just a commercial aircraft. By the time he came up, he'd missed his shot. And there's also a few stories about the boys from the submarine going ashore and milking cows in New Zealand. They're great tales, but I don't think they're true. But it was a great voyage for them. And eventually the submarine is handed back to goes back to Penang. And as Germany comes to an end of its war in May, what to do with these submarines? And most of them are handed over to the Japanese. The book Australia's Coastal War's got some unusual chapters. It's pretty much one-sided, but I did put a couple of chapters in to show that we are striking back. So it's mainly about attacks on Australia, but I wouldn't want people to think we weren't making an effort, especially by the time 1943 and beyond come. A couple of curiosities. For example, I calculated that 670 bombs were dropped on Darwin that didn't go off. Where are they now? Occasionally they find them. You find them when you're doing construction and so on, and everything has to stop. The Japanese bombs were either 60 kilograms or 250. 250 can really make a mess of your day, but 60 is really good too. Probably half of them would have ended up in the water. Doesn't mean they're not live. There's lots of wreckage around Darwin from the war, so don't go bringing these things home. And as I mentioned before, there's appendices at the back. And I think it's important to put in things like the boom nets that we had, the anti-submarine detection loop systems, the coastal guns, the big 9.2s inch on Rottnest Island, for example, the guns around Sydney. All of these are manned by people in World War II. And a lot of the time they don't get credit for it. Oh, Grandad never fired a shot in anger. It's a bit like having a factory and you buy a guard dog, and the guard dog does its job. And after 14 years of faithful service, it's getting a bit long in the tooth and so to get it retired. Shall we get another guard dog? Oh, of course not, it never bit anybody. It's deterrence. It's deterrence. That's what it's all about. So somebody in coastal gunnery in World War II, in my opinion, or searchlights, or those sort of things, should get a lot of credit for their efforts. So there's some final numbers. The thing with the fatalities is you tend to find things like a service action. If something like the Sydney goes down, it takes a lot of people with it. So 645 people on that ship. $105 ships all up, sunk around Australia in the war. And it's long and continuous. It's a long, continuous war with fatalities every day. There, for example, is 19 fatalities a day in the United States Army Air Forces. They were incurring by 1945. Now, about 6 out of 7 deaths are from accidents. Running into a mountain, running out of fuel, the aircraft falls out of the sky, somebody makes a mistake and a bomb goes off before it should. One death is combat. But all of them are listed as combat deaths because you'd hardly want to have that sort of news sent home to mum to think her son had died in vain. RAF's the same. I actually had a thought I was going to do some sort of calculation as to how many RAF aircraft were lost in World War II. They actually don't know. It's several thousand. They had thousands of aircraft in the war. And to do a calculation of all the RAF bombing raids out of Northern Australia in World War II also proved impossible. The records have been sort of neglected and it will be incomplete, so I didn't go down that road. But it's a long and hard and bloody war, and a reminder that between 60 to 80 million people died in World War II. And Shouldn't a historian like me be better at the results of numbers like that, 60 to 80 million? And how could I possibly just toss that into the air like that? Because the records were destroyed. It looks like the Russians paid the biggest loss, probably about 20 million dead. But if you're getting bombed relentlessly by the enemy, you're hardly starting to do the paperwork, are you? So it's a long and hard war. And as you can see, it's a long and hard war all around Australia. Because I think our knowledge should be maintained as to the sacrifice of these people and the efforts of these people, that was why I wrote Australia's Coastal War. Now, that brings me to a conclusion. But, have you been paying attention? Now, on specific design, so only put your hand up if you have a grandchild, I suggest. But on what day of the week was the Darwin Air Raid? The biggest one that hit Australia.
Thursday.
Thank you. Well done, sir. So, books on sale over there, what's left of them, and I've certainly got a little bit of time for questions, both now, formally, and then informally later. John.
Okay, so let's go.
What, if any, was the difference between the display that earned him the Victoria Cross finishing on Armadale and the bloke on HMAS Yarra?
None.
Exactly none?
T. Shem was a gunner. He was on a 20mm Aleican gun. Got a crew of 3 or 4. All of them are interchangeable, they can swap. He turned around as the ship was abandoning ship and it was on a list. And he went back to the gun because they were being strafed by the Japanese fighters and bombers still. Put his strap around his shoulders and get stuck in with the 20mm. The similarity between him and Ron Taylor on board the Yarra was the same. Abandoned ship was given. Robert Rankin, the commander, had been killed by this time. Everybody's getting into the water on anything that floats. And Ron Taylor said, this gun is going to fire as long as I've got breath in my body, to his friends, and refused to leave his gun and kept firing and went down with the ship. So no difference at all in my book.
Yes.
Do you know why the Germans bothered to send the U-boat or two to the Pacific in the late 1944 when they were under such pressure at home?
They sent 41 U-boats to the Pacific earlier in the war because they were asked by Japan to contribute more. Germany is a bigger submarine force than Japan. Japan had 128 fleet submarines and about 900 midget submarines in World War II. But the Germans are the biggest submarine fleet in the world. 1,176 submarines in World War II. By the end of the war, 780, if I remember rightly, were sunk. But they're a really big submarine force. And the Japanese basically said, we could use your help. And because they're a partner in the Axis, they weren't a very friendly partner. They didn't have a lot of cooperation in the war. But this is what Germany said they would do. So they sent the submarines and support ships to Penang, and they ran operations out of there.
Yep.
When you decide to write on a topic, what's sort of your process of getting started and researching?
Basically, I think, is there a need for the book? Because I'm only really interested in writing 2 things. One is a story that hasn't been told. So when I was asked to write the Midget Submarine book, I said to the publisher, there's a lot of good books, several good books on the Midget Submarine raid, and he said, you always say that, you always find something new, so get working. So I did. Muirhead Gould's neglect of the defence, I think, is a bit of a hook to hang that book on. So it's either something new or a myth that needs fixing, I think. And that was the reason I wrote the HMAS Sydney book, because there were so many myths and stories I thought it was so ridiculous. And they're quite an insult to the families of those who died. And I thought, come on, we can do better than this. So the book on Sydney is all about what it was like to live, fight and die on World War II warships for the families.
Someone over there, yep.
G'day, Tom. The work I'm applying on the south coast, I took a gentleman up to Saddleback Mountain, just outside Paloma there, a few years back, and his grandmother, he stated his grandmother was on a radar station on the top of Saddleback Mountain.
Mhm.
Now, she actually saw the spotter planes coming in and radioed through, and they just denied that was it. Well, can you confirm that would have been, there would be radar stations up there?
There were, number it was, I think it's 41 radar stations around Australia in World War II. I've got a chapter on it in one of the books. And they were manned largely by women.
Yes.
And the operation, basically, they took time to get going. For example, there was only one radar set in Darwin when the Japanese arrived, and it wasn't working on the 19th of February 1942. But as the war goes on, you get more and more radar stations. So I would say yes, truthfully enough. And I don't mean to pour too much scorn on people's efforts about defence. Everybody was making a lot of mistakes at the beginning of the war. You always do. I did. I certainly made some classic mistakes when I was in combat for the first time. I mean, a little typical one that everybody sort of would laugh at was I had 3 ammunition pouches across here, and in each I had a magazine for my assault rifle, 30-round magazine, and I had not buttoned them down. So when I bent down, somewhere or other to pick something up, they all fell out, and there's ammunition all over the floor. So you do lots of silly mistakes when you start off, but you get better as the enemy makes you undergo training, so to speak.
Obviously, you've done a lot of research over this and will know this in hindsight, but how much would the average Sydney-sider know about what was happening in Darwin? And how much of a shock was, the submarine attack in Sydney to the Sydney-siders?
Depends how much they read the papers, I suppose. There's a myth about Darwin and several other sort of areas that it was concealed by the government. It's not true. If you go into Trove, which is a really good online resource, you can hunt down the stories about what happened in Darwin. It says Darwin raided by scores of Japanese bombers. In fact, that's wrong, it was over 100 bombers. But nobody stops to count them, so to speak. And they were being reported steadily through the rest of the year that Darwin had been bombed, Broome had been attacked, Townsville's been attacked, and things like this. So they're there, they're reasonably inaccurate. So that sort of, I think, is the proof that Australians could know if they read the papers. The attack on Sydney was a surprise to most Sydney-siders from what I read. And one of the things about the aircraft surveillance flights, the reports have survived that the observer made. Sydney was not blacked out, which makes it really easy for submarines to attack ships and see what the navigation is and so on. The coastal lighthouses were still functioning. It was the same in America when Hitler's U-boats arrived in to start their attacks as the war started there. So it takes time for the civilians to realise that we're at war. So it was an attack that was a surprise. It was the night of the 31st, it was night. Lots of explosions from their stuff going off. One of the submarines blew itself up on the boom net, and it was pretty much on the surface when it did that, and the big bang. Then you've got depth charges, torpedoes and so on. When dawn breaks the next day, I think Sydney-siders started to take a serious look at themselves. Having said that, it didn't instantly mean that the defences were fixed very fast.
We've just got one more question, sorry, because we're running out of time. The last one.
Yeah, fabulous presentation, Tom. And I must admit, something about which I know very little. Having studied Gulf War II an awful lot, and this is something I knew very little about. You almost wonder, was there, because maybe the government didn't want to panic the public by letting them know how close the war really was getting into Australia on occasions, but they didn't say very much during the war, and then afterwards it was largely forgotten.
Yep.
It's largely been forgotten from history. It just seems a great tragedy because there's obviously been some incredibly heroic actions and some really important considerations to the way the war was conducted.
Yeah, and for example, the midget submarine attack, there were 2 inquiries run into it. Both of them were headed up by Muirhead Gould, who was supposedly in charge of the defence. So he came out of it quite well. But it looks like the government probably made a bit of a decision to let's not panic the population, let's not show ourselves as being absolute clowns, which we have been. because we need to rally the troops, we need to raise morale, and we're not going to raise morale by admitting that we've made some classic blunders. So you do get that. So one more, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
How do historians regard the inaccuracy of the War Memorial painting depicting Teddy Sheen firing the gun from flat on the deck?
That's reasonably accurate, I think. There was a fair inquiry into did the gun fire while he was underwater, because some of his companions who were in the boats and Carly floats and so on, Teddy Sheen fired, and as the water closed over the top of his Alicant gun, you could see the rounds coming out from the water. That's impossible. It doesn't work like that. So we actually did a little bit of investigation into the Navy. We're pretty sure that you can't fire an Alicant 20mm from underwater and it still comes out of the water, but it doesn't. We investigated that. But it's fairly accurate, that painting by Dale Marsh, I think it is. Yeah.
Well, the gun's designed to be fired from a standing position,
Yep.
and he's lying almost flat on his stomach.
Yeah, he's collapsing. Yeah, he's just got a handle on it.
How did the gun change shape?
Oh, it's got a bit of artistic license there.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
The historian's happy with that.
it's a great painting.
Well, can I just stop there? We do have a raffle with you to conduct in a moment, but just on behalf of the audience, Tom, thank you so much for providing an overview.
Thank you.